Do you miss those African-American dinners no one makes anymore? Back then, they turned scraps and garden greens into suppers that brought families together. So why did we ever stop cooking food that tasted this good? Potato and onion gravy over cornbread was one of those suppers that stretched simple ingredients into something far more satisfying than it looked. Families who did not have access to meat would fry onions in leftover drippings, add water and flour, and stir it into a thick brown gravy. That gravy, poured over wedges of cornbread, turned into a filling plate that could quiet hunger at the end of a long day. The onions gave sweetness, the drippings added depth, and the cornbread soaked it all up like a sponge. In African-American households across the South, this became a dependable way to feed large families on very little. Cornmeal was cheap, onions were plentiful, and gravy turned scraps into a real meal. Children might not have known they were eating out of necessity because it tasted comforting and rich. This dish has faded as quick meals replaced slow stove cooking, but for many who grew up with it, the memory of potato and onion gravy over cornbread still means home and survival. Cowfoot soup was once considered a true stick-to-your-ribs dinner in African-American kitchens, especially during lean years. Made by simmering cow feet slowly for hours, it produced a gelatin-rich broth that thickened naturally. Vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes were added to round it out, but the real heart of the dish was the deep, silky broth that clung to every spoonful. Families believed it gave strength and lasting fullness, which mattered when work was hard and meals were scarce. The dish required patience, since the feet had to cook down until tender, but the result was both nourishing and comforting. It carried a flavor unlike anything else, with a richness that no canned soup could match. Served with bread or rice, Cowfoot soup fed whole families for pennies. Though it has largely disappeared from modern tables, it once represented resilience, thrift, and a belief in food's power to sustain more than just the body. Stewed cabbage with neck bones was a heavy pot supper that reflected the creativity of African-American kitchens in the 1950s. Cabbage was cheap, filling, and easy to grow, while pork neck bones could be purchased for next to nothing at local butcher shops. Simmered together slowly, the cabbage soaked up the smoky, savory flavor of the bones, creating a meal that stretched to feed an entire family. A pot of this on the stove meant everyone would eat, even if there was no extra meat to share. Cornbread often accompanied the dish, soaking up the broth that formed at the bottom of the pot. Though humble, it was deeply flavorful and comforting, bringing families around the table after long days. Today, faster cooking and processed meals have replaced the patience of slow-simmered cabbage, but for those who grew up with it, the memory remains strong. Stewed cabbage with neck bones was a dinner born of thrift, tradition, and the determination to make even scraps taste like a feast. Rice and gravy from pan drippings may sound too plain to be dinner, but in African-American households, it was often the centerpiece of supper. After frying meat or even vegetables, the drippings left in the pan were turned into gravy with flour and water. That gravy, poured over hot rice, became a full meal in itself. Families appreciated it because rice was cheap and filling, while the gravy added flavor that made plain starch taste indulgent. Children grew up eating this regularly, and it carried a sense of comfort tied to ordinary evenings. Sometimes bits of onion or leftover vegetables were stirred into the gravy, but the heart of the dish was the simplicity of making do with what was available. It represented survival and creativity, turning the smallest leftovers into sustenance. Though it has faded from common memory, rice and gravy from drippings still stands as a reminder that resourcefulness can transform even the humblest ingredients into something worth remembering. Boiled collards with salted fish was a dish rooted in coastal traditions, where dried or salted fish met the greens of the field. Collard greens, simmered long with pieces of fish, absorbed the salty flavor and produced a broth that families called Potlikker. Served with cornbread on the side, it became a full meal that delivered both nutrition and satisfaction. This dish tied African-American kitchens to older traditions of using preserved fish as seasoning when fresh meat was unavailable. The salt balanced the bitterness of the collards while the fish gave body and protein to the broth. Families loved it because it was affordable and could feed everyone at the table. Children might not have enjoyed the strong flavor, but it carried cultural meaning that extended beyond taste. Though rarely seen today, boiled collards with salted fish once represented a connection between land and sea, resourcefulness and survival, and the enduring tradition of turning simple ingredients into communal suppers. Pickled pig's feet with crackers may sound like a snack today, but in the 1950s it was often eaten as a full dinner plate in African American households. The feet were simmered, then packed in vinegar brine until tender and tangy. Served cold with a stack of crackers, they offered protein, fat, and flavor at almost no cost. Families valued them because they made use of parts of the hog that others discarded, turning waste into sustenance. The vinegar gave the dish a sharpness that cut through the richness, making it both refreshing and hearty. Children might wrinkle their noses, but many adults grew up seeing it as a delicacy tied to memory and survival. This dish reflected the cultural habit of using every part of the animal, honoring thrift and tradition. Though it has nearly vanished outside of specialty shops, pickled pig's feet with crackers once carried pride, practicality, and a unique taste that is rarely experienced today. Cow tongue stew was another dish that stretched thrift into flavor, simmering what others discarded into something deeply satisfying. Tongue was cheap and often overlooked, but when braised slowly with onions, peppers, and garlic, it became tender and rich. The meat had a texture similar to roast beef, making it both hearty and comforting. Families who could not afford expensive cuts relied on tongue as an affordable way to bring meat to the table. Served over rice or potatoes, it filled plates and stomachs without emptying wallets. Though some children avoided it once they knew what it was, many still loved the taste and never forgot it. Cow tongue stew represented resilience, using skill and patience to make overlooked parts of the animal delicious. Today it is rare to see it served, but in the 1950s it was a sign of both thrift and pride in the kitchen. It showed that nothing was wasted and everything could be made into supper. Fried soubely with molasses was a dinner that blended savory and sweet in a way that still lingers in memory. Soubely or pork belly was inexpensive and high in fat, making it a common ingredient for working families. Sliced and fried crisp in a skillet, it was then drizzled with molasses, turning it into a dish that balanced salt, fat, and sweetness. Served with cornbread or potatoes, it made a plate that was both filling and deeply flavorful. Families loved it because it elevated a humble cut into something special, a small indulgence during hard years. The molasses gave the pork a sticky, caramelized coating that made the dish memorable for children and adults alike. Though it disappeared as leaner cuts became more common, fried soubelly with molasses once represented creativity and comfort. It proved that even the simplest, cheapest ingredients could create meals that felt indulgent and satisfying in every bite. Cornmeal dumplings in Potlikker were a staple of Southern African American kitchens, where nothing went to waste. After collard greens or turnip greens were boiled, the leftover broth, rich with nutrients and pork flavor, was called potlikker. Cornmeal dumplings, simple mixtures of cornmeal and water, were dropped into that broth and simmered until tender. The result was a starch-heavy, comforting dish that cost pennies but filled stomachs. Families valued it because it made the most of what was already cooking, turning leftovers into a whole new meal. For children, dumplings in potlikker were warm and familiar, often tied to memories of sitting around the table with family. The dish reflected both resourcefulness and tradition, showing how African American households transformed scraps into suppers that carried meaning. Though rare today, cornmeal dumplings in potlikker stand as one of the most powerful examples of thrift meeting comfort. They were practical, soulful, and unforgettable for those who grew up eating them. Baked coons or raccoon meat was once a common rural dish in African American communities where hunting remained a necessity. Raccoon was skinned, cleaned, and baked slowly with onions, peppers, and spices until tender. Sometimes the meat was stewed into gravy and poured over rice or potatoes, turning wild game into family supper. It was an accessible source of protein for households that could not afford store-bought meat, and hunters took pride in bringing it home. The flavor was gamey but savory, and when seasoned well, it was remembered as comforting and hearty. Children may have been squeamish about it, but for many families it was simply another part of survival. As supermarkets grew and hunting declined, baked raccoon disappeared from most dinner tables. Today it is nearly forgotten, but it once represented self-reliance, cultural tradition, and the ability to turn even the most unconventional meat into nourishment. Baked coons carried memory, heritage, and pride that still deserve recognition. Souse meat with vinegar and peppers was a tangy loaf that turned scraps into something families truly valued. Pig heads, ears, and other parts were boiled down until tender, seasoned with peppers and spices, then cooled until the broth turned gelatinous. Sliced cold, it was eaten with bread or crackers, making a thrifty dinner that filled stomachs when little else was available. African American families appreciated it because it wasted nothing and carried a bold flavor that stood out compared to plainer dishes. The vinegar gave it sharpness, the peppers added heat, and the texture was unlike anything else at the table. Children sometimes hesitated, but for adults it was a taste tied to survival and tradition. It was also served at gatherings, reminding everyone how community meals grew out of resourcefulness. Though rarely made today, souse meat was once a reminder that flavor and thrift could meet in unexpected ways. Its disappearance speaks to changing tastes, but for many it still recalls home and heritage in every bite. Poke salad greens were one of the most unusual and risky dinners that families once depended on during lean times. Pokeweed grew wild in fields and ditches, but it contained toxins that required repeated boiling before it could be safely eaten. After being boiled several times, the tender greens were fried in bacon grease, creating a dish that was flavorful and filling despite its humble origins. For African American households in rural areas, poke salad greens represented the practice of foraging when store-bought vegetables were too costly. They were seasonal, unpredictable, and sometimes the only green food available. The dish carried both danger and ingenuity, showing how families turned nature's weeds into supper. Cornbread often sat alongside the plate, soaking up the grease and juices. Though nearly forgotten today, poke salad greens were once a staple in communities where self-reliance meant survival. They reflected both courage and creativity in the kitchen, an echo of a time when every meal required effort, knowledge, and a willingness to make do. Stewed chicken feet were once prized for their gelatinous texture, which gave body and richness to soups and stews. African American families often simmered them slowly with onions, peppers, and seasonings, creating a dish that wasted nothing from the bird. The feet added thickness to the broth, turning a simple pot of vegetables into something hearty enough to feed everyone at the table. Children often found them odd, but adults valued their flavor, and the way they made scarce ingredients stretched further. In many households, chicken feet carried cultural memory, connecting meals to traditions brought from Africa and the Caribbean. They were inexpensive, easy to obtain, and a reminder that no part of the animal was left behind. While rarely eaten in Black homes today, stewed chicken feet once stood as a quiet testimony to thrift and survival. They made humble pots of food taste rich, nourishing both body and spirit. Their decline reflects changing times, but their history remains a vital part of dinner traditions. Fried carp with cornmeal crust was a dinner born from riverside living and community fish fries. Carp were plentiful in American rivers, and African American families caught them regularly, especially in rural areas. The fish was cleaned, coated in cornmeal, and fried crisp until golden brown, creating a meal that was inexpensive yet full of flavor. Cornmeal gave it crunch, while frying in hot grease added richness that made even the bony carp appealing. Families gathered outdoors, frying pans sizzling as fish came out one after another to feed hungry crowds. It was both dinner and celebration, a reminder of how community shaped food traditions. While carp later lost popularity to fish like catfish, in the 1950s it was still common on many tables. The flavor of fried carp may be forgotten now, but it once represented both self-reliance and joy. Fried carp with cornmeal crust was more than just a cheap dinner, it was an event that tied families and neighbors together. Molasses and butter over rice may sound like dessert, but for many African American families, it was a real supper when meat was out of reach. A pot of rice was boiled, then topped with butter and a drizzle of dark molasses, creating a dish that was sweet, rich, and comforting. Children loved it because of the sweetness, while parents valued its ability to fill empty stomachs quickly and cheaply. Rice stretched across multiple meals, and molasses was one of the most affordable sweeteners available at the time. Together, they created a plate that was both simple and satisfying. This dish carried echoes of resourcefulness from the Depression era, reminding families that food did not need to be complicated to be memorable. It was eaten hot from the stove, often as a stand-in for full dinner when money was gone. Though rarely made today, molasses and butter over rice was once a staple that brought warmth, sweetness, and resilience into households across the South. Rabbit and dumplings was a rural supper that leaned on hunting and simple flour cooking to keep families full. Rabbits were easy to catch, making them a dependable protein for those who could not afford store-bought meat. The meat was simmered into tender stews, then patted out with flour dumplings that floated in the broth and stretched the meal further. African American households valued rabbit because it represented self-reliance and survival. Dumplings were cheap, easy to prepare, and gave the pot a hearty feel that turned one rabbit into supper for everyone. The flavor was earthy, comforting, and tied closely to the land where the food came from. Families ate it together after long days in fields or factories, grateful for anything that filled plates. Though game has nearly vanished from modern kitchens, rabbit and dumplings once stood at the center of many suppers. It carried both necessity and comfort, showing how rural traditions shaped African American dinner tables for generations. Cow liver hash with potatoes was less famous than liver with onions, but it held a special place in thrifty kitchens. Chopped liver scraps were fried with diced potatoes, onions, and seasonings until the whole skillet was browned and savory. The potatoes absorbed the strong flavor of the liver, creating a hearty hash that stretched inexpensive organ meat into a full meal. African American families valued it because it made use of cuts that others ignored, turning what was cheap into something filling. Served hot with cornbread or rice, it became a dependable dinner for families living on tight budgets. Children often resisted the taste, but adults appreciated both its nutrition and practicality. This dish reflected the culture of never wasting food, using every part of the animal in creative ways. Cow liver hash with potatoes may have faded from memory, but it once stood as proof that even the least valued scraps could be transformed into dinner. It carried both thrift and pride in every bite. Braised pig snouts were another example of how African American families once used every part of the hog. Snouts were cheap, overlooked by many, and sold at butcher shops for pennies. Simmered slowly with onions, peppers, vinegar, and spices, they softened into tender meat that carried bold flavor. Served with rice, potatoes, or cornbread, braised pig snouts became a dinner that satisfied even when budgets were at their tightest. They were not glamorous, but they showed ingenuity and determination in the kitchen. For adults, the flavor was hearty and comforting, while children often found it unusual. Still, it represented the resourcefulness that defined so many meals in the mid-century South. Pig snouts, like many organ meats, gradually disappeared as families shifted to more popular cuts. Yet they remain an important part of culinary history, reflecting a time when nothing went to waste. Braised pig snouts were both humble and proud, a dish that deserves to be remembered for its place at dinner tables. Cold-fried chicken backs were one of those forgotten suppers that came out of necessity rather than preference. The backs were inexpensive because they held little meat, but when fried in seasoned cornmeal, they offered just enough flavor to be worth the effort. Families would fry large batches, then eat them cold at supper when reheating was not practical. They were often served with bread, pickles, or beans to round out the meal. Children nibbled around the bones, learning to savor every bite because waste was not an option. African American families valued chicken backs because they were cheap and available when other cuts were out of reach. Cold-fried chicken backs might sound odd now, but they once carried pride, thrift, and resourcefulness. They showed how families turned even the least desirable pieces into meals that held meaning and comfort. Though few remember them today, cold-fried chicken backs were a symbol of making do and finding satisfaction in what little you had. Goat neck stew was once a common supper in African American households where goat meat was inexpensive and accessible. The necks, often overlooked cuts, were simmered for hours with onions, peppers, garlic, and seasonings until the meat turned tender and rich. The broth thickened naturally, creating a stew that was hearty and flavorful. Served with rice or cornbread, it provided nourishment and comfort at very little cost. Goat was valued because it was affordable and available in local markets, especially in rural areas. Families appreciated how long cooking transformed tough cuts into delicious meals. The dish carried cultural connections to African and Caribbean traditions, keeping those flavors alive in American kitchens. Children grew up eating goat neck stew without realizing its historical roots, only remembering the warmth and fullness it brought. Today, it is rarely found on dinner tables, but it once represented thrift, tradition, and community pride. Goat neck stew deserves recognition as part of the forgotten history of African American suppers. Sorrel green stew was once a vibrant reminder of African roots carried into Southern kitchens. The leaves had a tangy, lemon-like flavor that brightened even the heaviest pot. Families simmered them with bits of pork, onions, and a splash of vinegar, making the taste both sharp and comforting. It was a dish born from resourcefulness, since sorrel often grew wild and could be gathered freely. In rural areas, it became a steady companion to cornbread, providing vitamins and flavor when meat was scarce. Many children remembered the sour kick, while adults valued how satisfying it felt at the end of the day. Sorrel green stew represented both survival and heritage, a meal that connected generations to traditions older than the country itself. Today, it has nearly disappeared from dinner tables, replaced by collards and turnip greens, but in its time it carried pride and nourishment. Sorrel green stew is a forgotten dish that once told the story of how African American families made the land itself part of supper. Cornmeal mush with fried salt pork was as simple as dinner could be, but its filling power kept families alive through lean years. Cornmeal was boiled into a soft porridge, poured into pans to cool, and sliced into thick squares once firm. Those slices were fried until crisp, then topped with sizzling bits of salted pork trimmings. The combination of crunchy, salty meat and hearty cornmeal was humble, but it stuck to the ribs and left no one hungry. Families appreciated it because both ingredients were cheap, easy to store, and endlessly reliable. It was eaten plain on some nights and dressed with molasses on others, but always remembered as a supper that could carry a family through. Children might not have seen it as exciting, but adults knew it was dependable and nourishing. Though rarely cooked today, cornmeal mush with fried salt pork still lingers in memory as one of the thrifty, flavorful ways African American households stretched every dollar in the 1950s. Turnip top soup made a meal from parts of the vegetable many would throw away today. The leafy tops and roots of turnips were simmered together into a thin broth, seasoned with onions, salt, and whatever scraps were on hand. Families often served it with cornbread, letting the bread soak up the juices and transform the soup into something hearty enough for supper. This dish represented thrift at its finest, stretching what others discarded into a meal that could feed large families. Turnip top soup was especially common in rural African American homes, where gardens provided food but money for meat was scarce. It was bitter yet earthy, and when cooked long enough, it developed a comforting richness. Children may not have loved the flavor, but it kept bellies full and carried the memory of older cooking traditions. Turnip top soup has faded from modern tables, but it once stood as proof that nothing needed to go to waste if you knew how to use it. Potted squirrel with brown gravy was a supper tied closely to hunting culture and rural survival. In many southern communities, squirrel was free protein that could be caught easily in fields and woods. The meat was simmered until tender, then smothered in brown gravy flavored with onions and peppers. Served with potatoes or rice, it turned into a hearty dinner that filled stomachs without costing money. Families saw it as a proud symbol of self-reliance, where hunters brought food directly to the table. Children might have balked at first, but the rich gravy made the dish taste comforting and familiar. Potted squirrel reflected an era when small game was part of daily cooking and not seen as unusual. It carried a connection to the land, resourcefulness, and tradition that is rarely found in kitchens today. As hunting declined and tastes changed, squirrel nearly disappeared from menus, but its history still shows how African American families once stretched every resource into supper. Stewed hog kidneys were one of those awful dishes that proved nothing went to waste in African American kitchens. Kidneys were cheap and often unwanted at butcher counters, but with long simmering and careful seasoning, they became tender and flavorful. Families cooked them slowly with onions, vinegar, and peppers, letting the strong flavors mellow into something savory. The dish was eaten over rice or with cornbread, turning scraps into a full supper. Adults appreciated its richness and practicality, though many children grew up disliking the taste. Still, it represented the culture of thrift, using every part of the hog with respect and skill. In the 1950s, dishes like this kept households fed even when money was scarce. Today, stewed hog kidneys are almost entirely forgotten, but in their time they carried both nutrition and heritage. They remind us of the determination to make food out of whatever was available, proving that creativity and patience could transform even the humblest organ meat into dinner. Potted doves with rice was once a staple in the South, where hunting game birds was part of daily life. Doves were small but plentiful, and when cooked down slowly into a peppery gravy, they provided flavor that stretched far. Families poured that gravy over rice, creating a meal that was both comforting and filling. It was inexpensive, practical, and tied closely to rural traditions of self-sufficiency. African American families valued it not only for its taste, but also for its connection to land and community. Children remembered gathering around the table with plates of rice soaked in savory sauce, a memory tied to warmth and survival. Potted doves with rice represented a culture where nothing was wasted and every meal was built from whatever was available. Though it has disappeared from most kitchens today, it once carried meaning and nourishment for entire households. It is a forgotten dinner that deserves recognition for the role it played in keeping families fed through leaner years. Hominy and Collard mix-up was a thick mash that combined two affordable staples into one hearty meal. Hominy, made from dried corn kernels, had a chewy texture that blended perfectly with the earthy bite of collard greens. Simmered together in a large pot, the mixture was seasoned with salt, pepper, and often a splash of hot sauce. Cornbread was served on the side, turning the plate into a full supper that cost almost nothing. Families appreciated how filling it was, stretching even the smallest budget into nourishment. For children, it was a dependable meal that tasted of home, while adults valued its nutrition and practicality. African American households leaned on dishes like this to keep food costs low without sacrificing flavor. Though it has nearly vanished from modern kitchens, hominy and collard mix-up once stood at the center of many dinners. It carried pride, resourcefulness, and tradition, showing how two humble ingredients could become something far greater when brought together. Braised duck necks were a supper that highlighted the ingenuity of families determined to waste nothing. Duck necks, often discarded, were simmered with onions, peppers, and garlic until the meat became tender and the broth richly flavored. The long cooking pulled every bit of nourishment from the bones, producing a dish that could be eaten with rice or potatoes. African American families valued it because it turned scraps into something hearty enough to feed everyone. Children may not have loved the bony pieces, but they remembered the rich gravy and flavor. It reflected a culture of resilience, where resourcefulness and patience shaped every meal. Braised duck necks were common in areas where hunting and farming kept ducks accessible, but the practice has nearly disappeared today. The dish showed that with creativity, even the most overlooked parts of an animal could be transformed into comforting dinners. Though forgotten now, braised duck necks once carried the memory of thrift and survival into every bite. Kush, sometimes called cornmeal hash, carried Civil War roots into African American kitchens well into the 1950s. It was a simple mixture of cornmeal, water, and bacon grease cooked into a thick, savory mash. Families stirred in onions or scraps of vegetables when available, turning it into a more substantial supper. Kush was inexpensive, filling, and easy to make, requiring only a skillet and a few pantry staples. African American households leaned on it when money was tight, and it became a dependable dinner that kept everyone fed. For children, it was comfort food, plain and hearty, while adults valued it as a reminder of survival traditions passed down over generations. Though it may sound simple today, kush represented resourcefulness at its core. It showed that even with limited ingredients, families could create something warming and satisfying. By the mid-20th century, it began to fade, but kush still deserves recognition as one of the forgotten dishes that shaped everyday life. Wild mustard greens with fatback were one of the most iconic examples of foraged suppers in African American kitchens. The greens were gathered from fields or ditches, washed carefully, and simmered slowly with chunks of pork fatback. The fatback added richness, salt, and a smoky flavor that balanced the sharp bite of the mustard leaves. Served alongside cornbread, the dish was both nutritious and filling, making it a complete meal on its own. Families appreciated how affordable it was since the greens were free and fatback was among the cheapest cuts available. It was a dinner that carried deep cultural roots, tying together land, thrift, and tradition. Children may have found the flavor strong, but adults valued its strength and nourishment. Today, wild mustard greens with fatback have nearly vanished from tables, but for many, they still symbolize the survival and resilience of earlier generations. It was a dish of pride and ingenuity, proving that foraged food could become supper. Which of these lost dinners would you bring back? Drop your pick in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more forgotten flavors.